Welcome to Module 2 of the 6-module training program for community partners. This is the second part of the 3-part training on Medicaid in 2014. Let's review our agenda for Module 2. During this module, we will cover Lesson 4, Determining Household Composition. Let's begin reviewing how the web portal, Washington Health Plan Finder, determines household composition. Although we are not expecting you to become experts after learning about household composition, this will provide you with a basic understanding. Even though Washington Health Plan Finder will establish the assistance units, in other words, the MAGI household, it will be helpful for individuals who assist families in the application process to understand the assistance unit rules so that they can both confirm that the system results are correct and no error was made in the data entry, and explain why some household members received different results. The system does a lot of behind-the-scenes verifying and eligibility determination. What is most important is that you enter the data into the system with the correct information. Household composition. What does that mean? An assistance unit is comprised of those household members who must be looked at together due to relationship, age, and tax filing status in order to determine the household size. Household size determines the income standard we use to determine an individual household member's eligibility. Income of other household members may be used in determining the household's income eligibility and size for an assistance unit. However, each individual in the family unit will have his or her own Medicaid determination. MAGI assistance rules can be found in Washington Administrative Code 182-506-0010, which became effective on October 1st, 2013. So in other words, assistance unit and household composition mean the same thing. There are several key components required to create assistance units, such as an individual's tax filing status, how household members are related to each other, the individual's age, and if a woman in the household is pregnant. Please note, if there is a pregnant woman in the household, the assistance unit, or units she is included in, is increased by 1 count for each unborn child. On the primary applicant's taxes screen in Washington Health Plan Finder, the following questions are asked: the tax filing status of the primary applicant, and how they filed tax for the past tax year, how they plan to file in the current tax year, and how they plan to file in the next tax year. The information gathered on this screen is used to create assistance units for determining eligibility. So from the individual who applies for medical on behalf of household members, Washington Health Plan Finder will first need to know whether the person who is applying is a tax filer, a tax dependent, or a non-filer, non-tax dependent. Washington Health Plan Finder will gather the data entered regarding each person's tax filing status or non-filing status, and from there it will establish the assistance units. For Medicaid, the Washington Health Plan Finder will gather the following tax filing information to be used as follows. For the past tax year, this will be used to draw down your MAGI income information. For the current tax year, this will be used to establish assistance units for the current year's Medicaid eligibility. And finally, for the next tax year, this will be used to determine eligibility for those who qualify for health insurance premium tax credits, what is sometimes abbreviated to HIPTC. On the application in Health Plan Finder, the applicant must indicate the tax filing status of every household member. There are 6 tax filing status choices: single filing taxes, married filing jointly, married filing separately, tax dependent of someone from the household, tax dependent of someone outside the household, and finally, quote, I am not a tax dependent and do not plan to file taxes, unquote. Please note that tax spouses need to have the same married tax filing status for any given year. If one spouse is married filing jointly for 2013, the other spouse must have the same tax filing status. Also, please note that if a household has a member with a tax dependent of someone from the household tax filing status, that household must also have a member with a tax filer status, either single filing taxes, married filing jointly, or married filing separately. In other words, if there is a tax dependent in the household, there must be someone who is claiming that person as on his or her taxes. So when determining an individual's household size, what we will call the assistance unit, there are 3 rules to consider. We will consider Rule 1 first. So Rule number 1 provides for the assistance unit of tax filers. Tax filers are household members with any of the 3 tax filing statuses. That is, single filing taxes, which includes the head of household tax filer status, married filing jointly, and married filing separately. The assistance unit of tax filers consists of the tax filer, his or her spouse who is living with him or her, and all individuals the tax filer expects to claim as a tax dependent in the current tax year, regardless of age. Here is an example of a tax filer's assistance unit. John is an unmarried 20-year-old residing in his parents' home. His parents do not claim him as their tax dependent. He expects to be filing his own taxes this year and does not have any dependents. For this situation, Rule number 1 would apply. When John applies in Health Plan Finder, he will indicate that he is applying for himself. Since he is unmarried and has no dependents, his assistance unit will consist of only John, even though he lives with his parents. His parents' income will not be counted, as they will not be claiming him as a tax dependent. So, only John's income will be taken into account when determining his eligibility for Medicaid. When entering the tax filing status of a single adult like John, who was unmarried and not being claimed as a tax dependent, you will select the tax filing status of single filing taxes. Rule number 2 applies when the applicant does not expect to file a tax return in the current year. If the applicant expects to be claimed as a tax dependent by someone else, the tax dependent's assistance unit will be exactly the same as the assistance unit of the tax filer who expects to claim him or her, which will be the tax filer, his or her spouse if applicable, and all of their tax dependents, unless the tax dependent meets one of the 4 exceptions to this rule, which we'll consider on the next slide. If the applicant does not expect to be claimed as a tax dependent by someone else, the individual is a non-filer, non-tax dependent for whom Rule 3 will apply, and we'll cover that in just a bit. Rule number 2 has 4 exceptions. Even though the individual may be claimed by someone else on his or her tax return, Rule number 2 will not apply if the individual meets one of the following 4 exceptions. The individual is a child under age 19 living with parents who do not file a joint tax return. The individual is a child under age 19 who expects to be claimed by a non-custodial parent. The individual is a child under the age of 19 who lives with both parents and the parents are not married to each other. And the individual expects to be claimed as a tax dependent by someone other than a spouse or parent. If one of the exceptions to Rule number 2 applies to the tax dependent, then Rule number 3 will be used to determine the individual's assistance unit. In other words, even though the individual is a tax dependent, the individual will be treated the same as a non-tax filer, non-tax dependent. Remember, each household member will have a separate eligibility determination. So, here we have an example of married parents with a common child. This example applies both Rule number 1 and Rule number 2. Bob and Susie file taxes as married filing jointly, and they claim Tommy as their tax dependent. Rule number 1 applies to Bob. He is a tax filer and is not going to be claimed as a tax dependent by someone else. Therefore, Bob's assistance unit is himself, his spouse, Susie, and their son, Tommy. Rule number 1 also applies to Susie, because she is married to Bob, and they file taxes as married filing jointly. Her assistance unit is the same as Bob's, which includes herself, her husband, and their son Tommy. Rule number 1 does not apply to Tommy because he is not a tax filer. Tommy is being claimed as a tax dependent by his parents. Therefore, Rule number 2 applies to Tommy, and none of the 4 exceptions in rule number 2 applies. Following rule number 2, his assistance unit is the same as the tax filer who claims him and consists of his parents and himself. So when entering the information to Health Plan Finder, the applicant would select married filing jointly for both Bob and Susie, and tax dependent of someone from the household for Tommy. By entering the relationships between everyone in the household, for example, Bob is parent of Tommy and Tommy is child of Susie, etc., and the tax filing status of every household member, Health Plan Finder will determine the assistance unit of everyone in the household as we saw on the prior slide. If rule number 1 did not apply, and rule number 2 did not apply, and rule number 2 applied, but one of the 4 exceptions to rule number 2 applied, rule number 3 will apply to the individual. The individual will be treated as a non-filer, non-tax dependent. A non-filer's assistance unit must include the individual, his or her spouse, any children under age 19, and, if the applicant is under the age of 19, his or her parents and any of the siblings who are also under age 19, as long as they all live in the same home. This includes natural, adopted, and stepchildren relationships. Now we have an example of a non-custodial parent claiming a child as a tax dependent. In this scenario, Ryan and Carrie are married. They have a common child, Austin. Carrie has a child from a previous relationship as well, named Monica. Ryan and Carrie file taxes jointly and claim their child, Austin, as their tax dependent. Monica's non-custodial father claims her as his tax dependent. Let's figure out the assistance units for these 4 individuals. We will need to apply all 3 rules, including exception number 2 to rule number 2. For Ryan, rule number 1 applies. Ryan is a tax filer and is not going to be claimed as a tax dependent. His assistance unit is himself, his spouse, Carrie, and their child, Austin. Since he is not claiming Monica as a tax dependent, she is not included in his assistance unit. For Carrie, rule number 1 also applies. She is married to Ryan. Her assistance unit is the same as Ryan's. Since Monica is not claimed as a tax dependent, she is not included in Carrie's assistance unit as well. For Austin, rule number 2 applies. He is not a tax filer and will be claimed as a tax dependent by his parents. Austin does not meet one of the 4 exceptions in rule number 2. As a result, his assistance unit is the same as his parents, including himself and both Ryan and Carrie. Since Monica is not claimed by Austin's parents, she is not included in Austin's assistance unit. For Monica, rule number 3 applies. She is a tax dependent, but she falls under one of the 4 exceptions to rule number 2. She is a child under the age of 19 who expects to be claimed by a non-custodial parent. As a result, Monica's assistance unit includes herself, her mother Carrie, her stepfather Ryan, and her sibling Austin, because Austin lives in the same home as Monica. In this case, depending on the family's income, it is possible that Monica would be eligible for Washington Apple Health for Kids, and Austin for health insurance premium tax credits, because Austin's assistance unit only contains 3 people, while Monica's assistance unit contains 4. Because Monica does not live with her non-custodial father, who claims her as a tax dependent, his income is not counted when determining her eligibility for Medicaid. So when applying for health care coverage for the whole family in the scenario of a non-custodial parent claiming a child as a tax dependent, the following tax filing statuses are selected in Health Plan Finder. Married filing jointly for both Ryan and Carrie, tax dependent of someone from the household for Austin, and tax dependent of someone outside the household for Monica. Remember, by entering the filing status correctly for each individual, Washington Health Plan Finder will determine each assistance unit. Now let's consider 5 more scenarios. If you would like to test yourself, go ahead and pause the web training session at each scenario and try to figure out which rule applies and who will be included in the assistance unit of each household member. We will go through the answers on the slides following the scenario slides. Before we continue to the exercise, here is a brief summary of the 3 rules for household composition determination. As we explained earlier, Health Plan Finder will apply these rules to every application. You just need to answer the relationships between the household members and the tax filing status of each household member correctly. But by understanding these rules, you will be able to confirm your Health Plan Finder results. So if you'd like to take a moment to review these rules, go ahead and hit pause. Scenario number 1. Single adult claimed as a tax dependent. Kim is a single 19-year-old living with her parents. Kim's parents will be claiming her as their tax dependent. Kim is applying for Medicaid, but her parents are not. What rule applies to Kim? Who will be in Kim's assistance unit? Feel free to pause here to answer the questions and then press play when you are ready. For scenario number 1, Kim is a single 19-year-old living with her parents. Kim's parents will be claiming her as their tax dependent. Kim is applying for coverage, but her parents are not. What rule applies to Kim? Rule number 2. Because she is not filing taxes and will be claimed as a tax dependent. Who will be in her assistance unit? That will be Kim and her mother and father who claim her. When Kim applies in Washington Health Plan Finder for coverage, she would indicate that she is a tax dependent of her parents. Kim's parents' income would be considered when determining her eligibility. When listing who is applying for healthcare coverage, she would select myself to indicate that her parents are not seeking coverage. So for scenario number 1, what tax filing status will Kim select in the Health Plan Finder for each member of her household? In Health Plan Finder, Kim would select the following: tax dependent of someone from household for Kim. Again, in this scenario, Kim will also need to make sure she adds her parents to her household in Health Plan Finder, and she will need to indicate that they are married filing jointly and that she is applying for coverage for herself only. Scenario number 2. Married parents with a child in common filing taxes separately. Daniel and Kevin are married and have a minor child, Sophia, whom they adopted. Daniel and Kevin file separately, and Daniel is claiming child Sophia as his tax dependent. What rule does Daniel fall under? Who will be in his assistance unit? What rule does Kevin fall under? Who will be in his assistance unit? And finally, what rule will Sophia fall under? Who will be in her assistance unit? Feel free to pause here to answer the questions and then press play when you are ready. For scenario number 2, married parents with a child in common filing taxes separately. Daniel and Kevin are married and have a minor child, Sophia, whom they adopted. Daniel and Kevin file separately, and Daniel is claiming child Sophia as his tax dependent. What rule applies to Daniel? That will be rule number 1, because Daniel is a tax filer and is not going to be claimed as a tax dependent. Who will be in Daniel's assistance unit? That will be himself, his husband Kevin, and their child Sophia, because Daniel will be the one claiming their daughter as his tax dependent. What rule applies to Kevin? Rule number 1, because he is also filing taxes. Who will be in Kevin's assistance unit? He must include himself and his spouse Daniel, because they are married. Can he also include Sophia in his assistance unit? The answer would be no, because he does not claim Sophia on his taxes, so his assistance unit will only be Kevin and his spouse. What rule applies to Sophia? Rule number 3, because she meets one of the exceptions under rule number 2, a child under the age of 19 living with parents who do not file a joint tax return. Who will be in Sophia's assistance unit? Her assistance unit will be herself, and because she is under the age of 19 and living at home, we must include both her parents, Daniel and Kevin. So for scenario number 2, married parents with a child in common filing taxes separately, what will be the tax filing status in Health Plan Finder for each person applying for Medicaid? The tax filing status of each household applicant would be indicated as shown: married filing taxes separately for both Daniel and Kevin, and tax dependent of someone from the household for child Sophia. Scenario number 3. Unmarried parents with a child in common. Sean and Kelly are unmarried with a child in common, Molly. Sean and Kelly file taxes separately. Kelly claims child Molly as her tax dependent. Starting with Sean, what rule does he fall under? Is Kelly included in his assistance unit? How about Molly? For Kelly, what rule does she fall under, and why? Who will be in her assistance unit? What about Molly? And finally, what rule does Molly fall under? Why? Who will Molly's assistance unit consist of? Feel free to pause here to answer the questions and then press play when you are ready. For Scenario 3, unmarried parents with a child in common, Sean and Kelly are unmarried with a child in common, Molly. Sean and Kelly file taxes separately, and Kelly claims Molly as her tax dependent. So what rule applies to Sean? That will be rule number 1, because Sean is filing taxes and is not going to be claimed as a dependent. Who will be in Sean's assistance unit? Only Sean, because he and Kelly are not married, and she is not being claimed by Sean as a tax dependent, so Kelly is not included. Child Molly is also not included in Sean's assistance unit because he is not claiming Molly as a tax dependent. What rule applies to Kelly? Rule number 1, because she is filing taxes and will not be claimed as a tax dependent by anyone else. But who will be in Kelly's assistance unit? That will be Kelly and Molly. Sean cannot be included because he is not her husband and she is not claiming him as a tax dependent, but Molly is included because Kelly claims Molly as her tax dependent. So what rule applies to Molly? Rule number 3, because she meets one of the exceptions to rule number 2. She lives with both parents, and the parents are not married to each other. So who will be in Molly's assistance unit? That will be herself, and because she is under age 19, her assistance unit must include both her parents, Sean and Kelly. So for scenario number 3, unmarried parents with a child in common, what will be the tax filing status for every household member applying for health care coverage? In Health Plan Finder, the tax filing status of each household member applying for health care coverage would be indicated as shown. Single filing taxes for both Sean and Kelly, and tax dependent of someone from the household for child Molly. Scenario number 4, parents unmarried with a child in common and a child not in common. Carl and Amy are not married. They have one child in common, Corey, and a child, Brenda, who is Carl's child from a previous relationship. Carl and Amy file taxes separately. Carl claims both Corey and Brenda as his tax dependents. So what rule applies to Carl? Who will be in his assistance unit? What rule applies to Amy? Who will be in her assistance unit and why? Are Corey and Brenda included in her assistance unit? What rule does Corey fall under? Who will be in his assistance unit? And finally, what rule does Brenda fall under? Who will be in her assistance unit? Please feel free to pause here to answer the questions and then press play when you are ready. For scenario number 4, parents unmarried with a child in common and a child not in common, Carl and Amy are not married. They have one child in common, Corey, and child Brenda, Carl's child from a previous relationship. Carl and Amy file taxes separately. Carl claims both Corey and Brenda as his tax dependents. So what rule applies to Carl? Rule number 1, because Carl is a tax filer and is not going to be claimed as a tax dependent. Who will be in Carl's assistance unit? Himself, his child Corey, and his child Brenda, both of whom he claims as his tax dependents. Amy is not included because they are not married and Carl does not claim her as a tax dependent. What rule applies to Amy? Rule number 1, because Amy is a tax filer and is not going to be claimed as a tax dependent. Who will be in Amy's assistance unit? Only Amy, because she is not married to Carl nor claiming him as a tax dependent. Children Corey and Brenda also would not be included as Amy will not claim them as her tax dependents. Now we get to Corey. What rule applies to him? Rule number 3, because he meets one of the exceptions in rule number 2. He is a child under the age of 19 who lives with both parents and the parents are not married to each other. Who is included in Corey's assistance unit? That would be Corey, both his parents, and his sibling Brenda, because he is under the age of 19 and Rule 3 requires his assistance unit to include both his parents and his siblings who are under age 19. What rule applies to Carl's child Brenda? Rule number 2, because she is a tax dependent and lives with the tax filer who claims her. Who was included in Brenda's assistance unit? That will be Brenda, her father Carl, who claims her as a tax dependent, and her half-brother Corey, who must be included because Brenda's assistance unit must be exactly the same as that of the tax filer who claims her, who is Carl. Brenda does not meet any of the exceptions in rule number 2, and Brenda does not include Amy because Amy is not her mother and does not claim Brenda as a tax dependent. So this would be a household where, depending on the family's income, one sibling might receive Apple Health for Kids, and the other sibling might be eligible for health insurance premium tax credits due to the household size of each child being different. So, for scenario number 4, unmarried parents with a child in common and a child not in common, what would be the tax filing status of each household member applying for health care coverage in the Health Plan Finder? In scenario number 4, they would select the tax filing status of each household member as shown. Single filing taxes for both Carl and Amy, and tax dependent of someone from the household for both children Corey and Brenda. Finally, in scenario number 5, we have a non-parent with a tax dependent. Grandpa and Grandma are married and live with their granddaughter, Melissa. The grandparents file taxes together and claim Melissa as their tax dependent. So for Grandpa, what rule applies? Who will be in his assistance unit? For Grandma, what rule applies? Who will be in her assistance unit? And finally, for Melissa, what rule applies to her? Who will be in her assistance unit? Feel free to pause here to answer the questions and then press play when you are ready. For scenario number 5, non-parent claims child as a tax dependent. Grandpa and Grandma are married and live together with the granddaughter Melissa. The grandparents file taxes and claim Melissa as their tax dependent. What rule applies to Grandpa? Rule number 1, because Grandpa is a tax filer and is not going to be claimed as a tax dependent. Who is included in Grandpa's assistance unit? That would be himself, his wife, and his granddaughter Melissa. His assistance unit includes his spouse, Grandma, who lives with him, and his grandchild, Melissa, whom he claims as a tax dependent. What rule applies to Grandma? Rule number 1, because she is a tax filer and is not going to be claimed as a tax dependent. Who is included in Grandma's assistance unit? Herself, her husband, Grandpa, and her grandchild, Melissa. Her assistance unit includes her spouse and her grandchild, whom she claims as a tax dependent. Finally, what rule applies for grandchild Melissa? Rule number 3, because she meets one of the exceptions to rule number 2. She expects to be claimed as a tax dependent by someone other than a spouse or parent. Who was included in Melissa's assistance unit? Only Melissa, because she is not living with a parent or spouse. Her assistance unit includes only herself. This means that only Melissa's income is countable, if she has any, when determining her eligibility for health care coverage. So for scenario number 5, what will be the tax filing status of each household member applying for health care coverage in the Health Plan Finder? For scenario number 5, they would select the tax filing status of each household member as shown. Married filing jointly for both Grandpa and Grandma, and tax dependent of someone from the household for grandchild Melissa. Congratulations! You have completed Module 2 of the Healthcare Authority Community-Based Training. Please continue on to Module 3 of the 6-module HCA Community-Based Training Program.